I found this place by accident. A small town in the mountains where tourists rarely stop. It was the perfect option for a few days of rest from the hustle and bustle of the city. The photos on Airbnb promised a cozy house with antique furniture, a fireplace and huge windows overlooking a dense forest. I arrived late at night. It had been raining all day and the road to the house was covered in fog. When I stopped the car, the air was bitterly cold, and the silence seemed to carry its own weight. The mysterious interior was perfectly preserved, as if time had stopped many years ago. Heavy curtains, old paintings on the walls, a sofa with worn upholstery, everything looked like something out of a horror movie. But it didn't scare me. On the contrary, I was delighted with the atmosphere. The owner did not meet me personally. The keys were in the mailbox and the instructions were sent via the app. It seemed convenient to me and I gladly set about living in a new temporary home. After I unpacked the things, I noticed a strange detail. The windows were blocked from the outside. I thought it was for protection from the elements, but the discomfort began to creep in. However, nothing portended trouble, and I decided that I was just tired of the road. The fireplace crackled with fire, spilling warm rays of light, and I felt myself slowly relax. It was not easy to go to sleep. In the darkness of the room, I heard something strange. A soft creak, a faint rustling as if someone was walking under the floor or behind the walls. But I attributed it to the old age of the house and fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night from the feeling that someone was standing next to me. A cold breath on my neck made me open my eyes instantly. But there was no one in the room. Only darkness and the soft sound of rain outside the window. I decided it was a dream and tried to go back to sleep. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I heard a knock. A quiet, annoying knocking from outside the window where no one should have been. This was just the beginning of my journey into this home. The knocking did not stop. It was rhythmic and persistent, as if someone outside the window was trying to get my attention. I lay in the dark, snuggled up against the blanket, trying to calm myself down and convince myself that it was just the sound of rain falling on wooden boards. But this sound was too regular. My mind began to wander as I imagined worst-case scenarios. Finally, I decided to check. Slowly getting up from the bed, I went to the window. My hands were shaking as I pushed back the heavy curtains, my heart pounding in my chest. The night was dark, nothing could be seen except the fog floating over the ground. But the knocking did not stop. I pulled myself together and listened, trying to determine where he was coming from. The knocking was clearly coming from outside the window, but I couldn't see anything that could have caused it. For several minutes I stood staring into the darkness until the sound suddenly stopped, leaving me in complete silence. My heart began to calm and I decided to return to bed, when suddenly I heard another sound, a soft whisper, barely audible, but clearly audible in the silence of the room. Open. It was like a lightning strike. I jerked back from the window and again the curtains closed it, plunging the room into complete darkness. My thoughts were confused, my heart was pounding in my chest. I began to ask myself if it was a dream or if my thoughts were already failing me due to fatigue. Open. That whisper came again, now closer, as if someone was standing right outside the door. My mind panicked, but I pulled myself together and walked to the door and pressed my ear against it. Silence. Absolute eerie silence. I stopped, hesitating. My body was shackled with fear. But in the end, I decided that checking the door would be the smart thing to do, otherwise I would just go crazy with the noises. Opening the door, I saw only a dark corridor that stretched forward like an endless wasteland. No sign of anyone whispering or knocking. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. Returning to the room, I decided that there was nothing left but to simply wait for the morning. I lay down in bed again trying to sleep, but every sound, every shadow in the dark made me anxious. I was about to fall asleep when I heard the door creak again. Someone or something slowly entered the room. My body froze in bed, paralyzed with fear. The door creaked again and I felt something heavy and invisible move towards me. My heart was pounding as if it was going to jump out of my chest. I couldn't move, I couldn't even take a deep breath. I just listened to what was happening in the room. The sounds were so quiet that it was difficult to make them out, but I definitely heard a faint rustling like the rustling of a cloth on the floor. Whatever it was coming. Gradually, step by step, the darkness seemed to thicken around me. I forced myself to open my eyes. In the semi-darkness of the room I could see nothing suspicious, but I felt the presence of someone or something that could not be part of my imagination. My heart was beating so loudly that I was afraid the creature could hear it. I took a slow breath and tried to focus on the darkness, hoping it was just my imagination. And suddenly I saw it. In the corner of the room where the shadows seemed thickest, something moved. It was a dark figure that stood motionless, but its outlines were vague as if it itself were made of shadow. I wanted to believe that it was just a play of light and darkness, but just as I thought that maybe it was just an illusion, a figure stepped forward. I almost screamed but forced myself to be silent. The figure had no facial features, just a dark silhouette approaching me. Each step was barely audible, but I felt it like hammer blows in my chest. As the figure came closer, it stopped by my bed. I tried not to move, not to breathe, hoping she wouldn't notice me, but I felt a cold breath touch my face. That breath was so icy that I couldn't help but shiver. My body was paralyzed with fear. And suddenly the figure spoke. Her voice was still a whisper, but now it was right above my ear. "You shouldn't have come here." These words pierced me like a dagger. I didn't know if it was a dream, a nightmare, or something worse. But I realized one thing: I am not alone here, and this presence has bad intentions. The figure began to move back, its whispers fading into the darkness, leaving me alone in the room. But this fear, this cold horror, stayed with me. I couldn't stay here any longer. This place was wrong and I made a mistake to come here. But it was impossible to run away. I was trapped in this house, realizing with every moment that something was waiting for me here. Something that won't stop until it gets what it needs. I spent the rest of the night in tense anticipation, not closing my eyes. The terrible cold from the figure standing by my bed would not let me go. My mind was racing between trying to explain that it was just a nightmare and the deep conviction that I was in for something far more terrifying. When the first rays of dawn began to seep through the gaps in the curtains, I finally dared to get out of bed. All I could think about was getting out of this house as quickly as possible. After going through the house, I started to pack, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every sound in this old house made me panic. The creaking of the floor, the faint hum of the wind outside the window, even my own footsteps seemed to echo with an ominous echo. I kept looking in all directions, expecting to see the same figure in the shadows. Before I left, I decided to leave the keys in the kitchen, where I found a small note from the host. The note was short and formal, but there was one line at the end that caught my attention: "Don't stay the night longer than necessary." These words made me even more wary. I quickly grabbed my things and headed for the exit. But when I got to the door, I found it wouldn't open. The lock seemed to jam and I could not turn the key. Panic began to grip me with new force. I tried other doors, but they were all locked. My hands were shaking as I tried to free myself, but nothing would come out. It seemed that the house itself decided not to let me go. Suddenly I heard a sound, soft but clear. It was a rustling sound, as if someone was moving on the floor. The sound came from below, from the basement, the door to which I hadn't noticed before. I stood at that door and fear filled my heart. I didn't want to know what was there, but something about this house attracted me, as if an invisible force was drawing me to this place. I slowly opened the basement door. The darkness swallowed all the light and I felt the cold air rise from below, enveloping me in its icy breath. But something else made me hold my breath: the smell. The smell of dampness mixed with something rotten and suffocating. I had to go down. Although I knew it was the worst thing I could do, my legs carried me forward. With each step down the stairs, I could hear something moving in the darkness. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in the basement, where only a faint ray of dawn light filtered through a small window. I could not see anything around me, but I felt that someone or something was here with me. And then I saw it. In a dark corner of the basement, on the floor, lay a small box. It looked old, wooden, with a dark, almost black finish. It was engraved with symbols that I couldn't make out, but they seemed familiar, yet strange at the same time. I moved closer, unable to stop myself, and slowly opened the box. Inside was a stack of old photos. Faces of strangers, places I'd never seen, and something else that seemed like a lost time. But among these photos there was one that made me freeze. It was a photo of this house. And I stood before him, with the shadow of the same figure I had seen that night, right behind me. My heart stopped for a moment when I saw that photo. It looked as if it had been taken a few minutes ago. I was standing in front of the house, and behind me I could clearly see a shadowy figure, the same one that approached my bed at night. It couldn't be true. After all, I knew for sure that no one was around when I arrived here. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but deep down I knew it was impossible. The photos in the box were old, yellowed by time. I started flipping through them one by one, and with each new picture my fear only grew. In each photo, there were different people standing in the background of this house, all of them looking anxious, some of them with expressions of horror on their faces, and behind each of them the same shadowy figure could be seen. It seemed as if this house was connected to her. And now I too was a part of this terrible story. My breathing became heavy, I could feel a cold sweat running down my back. It was necessary to run away. Immediately. Suddenly I heard the creak of the stairs. Someone was going down. It was a soft, barely audible sound, but it made me freeze in place. I looked up at the dark stairs where something was approaching. The shadow from the small window fell on the stairs, but I could not see who or what was approaching me. I clutched the photo tightly and began to slowly walk back into the depths of the basement. My back hit the wall and I realized that there was nowhere to retreat. The light from the window disappeared, and the basement was plunged into complete darkness. The footsteps stopped on the stairs. Only my heavy breathing and the pounding of my heart could be heard. I listened, trying to figure out what it could be, but there was a silence like before a storm. Suddenly I heard something else, a low but distinct whisper. It echoed from all sides surrounding me and I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel every sound seeping under my skin. And then, for a moment, I saw it. A face flashed in the darkness, pale, with empty eyes staring intently at me. It was only a moment, but it was enough to make me barely hold back a scream. I threw the photo on the floor and frantically searched for a way out. I found a door leading from the basement. They were heavy, wooden, with a large metal latch. I realized it was the exit to the backyard. I tried my best to open it, but the latch was stuck. There was no time, the steps were approaching again. My panic grew and I finally yanked the bolt with such force that it gave way and the door opened. I jumped outside to be greeted by a cold dawn. The humid air refreshed me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. Without looking back, I ran away from the house. But even when I was already far away, the feeling that I was being watched did not disappear. I ran out onto the road where my car used to be. But when I saw it, I realized that it wouldn't start. Panic began to overtake me again. I nervously pulled my phone out of my pocket, trying to dial the emergency number, but there was no signal. And then I heard a soft creak, as if someone was opening the door of the house behind me. Turning, I saw the figure, again the same, slowly coming out of the door. She stood motionless, watching me. And then I realized that escaping might be a lot harder than I thought. I froze in place, unable to take my eyes off the figure standing by the door of the house. She was where the shadows and the light met, so close that I could make out the details of her outline. She was not just a black shadow, but a figure shrouded in thick darkness, absorbing any light that fell upon her. But the scariest thing was that I could feel her gaze, which was directed directly at me. I couldn't stay here a moment longer. My car was my only chance of salvation. Even if it wouldn't start, it was my only refuge. I quickly jumped inside, closed the door and tried to calm myself down to focus. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine didn't even make a sound. Another attempt, one more, all in vain. The figure began to slowly move toward me, step by step, approaching along the gravel path. I gripped the steering wheel nervously, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I had to act fast. Although I understood that the chances were minimal, I tried to start the car again. The engine began to choke, and suddenly I heard a faint grunt, hope. I tried again, and this time the engine started. Turning the key sharply, I hit the gas and the car sped off. The wheels caught the gravel and I felt the tires begin to slide. But I didn't stop. I jerked forward, oblivious to the winding road ahead of me. The figure remained behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still haunting me. I raced down the narrow road, not minding the turns or obstacles. My only desire was to get as far away from this horrible place as possible. But even when the house disappeared over the horizon, I felt that something dark and terrible continued to pull after me, not letting go. The road took me onto the main highway where I finally allowed myself to slow down a bit and catch my breath. But I was still wary. Thoughts about what happened swarmed in my head, not giving me peace. What was it? Who or what was chasing me? And most importantly, why did I become a victim of this nightmare? My car was passing signs pointing to the nearest town, and I decided to turn there to find some safe place and rethink everything that had happened. But even in the center of the city, among people, I could not get rid of the feeling of danger. It seemed to me that the figure could appear anywhere, that it was following me. I found a motel on the outskirts, small and cozy, where I stayed for the night. However, I could not sleep. It seemed to me that every sound in the corridor was her steps, that the shadows on the walls were beginning to move. I remained on my bed, watching, waiting for what might happen at any moment. That night I thought I heard the same whispers I heard in the basement, soft and elusive but very real. It came from right outside the door, and I realized with horror that she had found me even here. But I couldn't run anymore. I was cornered and realized that now was my time to learn the truth. The whispering from behind the door grew louder, became clearer, penetrated every corner of my mind. They weren't just random noises, they were words I couldn't make out that made my skin crawl. They were like a spell that pulled me into a vortex of fear. I could feel that whisper penetrating deeper than any other sound I had ever heard. I couldn't stay here a minute longer. Grabbing my backpack, I quietly approached the door. My hands were shaking as I gently placed my palm on the doorknob. I was overcome with fear, but at the same time with a strange determination. Opening the door, I saw an empty corridor bathed in dim light. But the feeling that something was wrong here was unbearable. I stepped out into the hallway, moving forward slowly and cautiously, barely breathing. The whispers that used to come from outside the door now seemed part of this motel. It was everywhere, mixed with the sounds of old walls and creaking floors. The corridor seemed to live its own life, and I was its only guest. Every step echoed in the silence. My heart pounded with each new sound. I reached the stairs and without hesitation went down to the first floor. The reception was empty, even the night duty officer had disappeared somewhere. It was so strange that I felt the hair on the back of my neck start to stand on end. I hurried to the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. They were locked from the inside. I tried again, but to no avail. My panic began to turn into despair. What's going on? Who locked this door? I was trapped. The whispering grew louder. He was now too close, as if right behind me. I turned sharply, but again I did not see anyone. However, the feeling that someone was watching me was unbearable. I started to back away from the door, looking for another way out, when I suddenly heard a sound like something heavy had fallen to the floor. This sound came from the depths of the corridor that led to the rooms. I hesitated, but understood that I had to find out what happened there. My fear was turning into a desperate need to understand what dark forces were chasing me. I turned back into the corridor and began to move in the direction of the sound. Every step seemed heavy, every breath heavy with fear. I walked to the door of the last room at the end of the corridor. They were slightly open and a dim light poured from them. I slowly opened the door and what I saw made me freeze in place. The room was empty except for one object on the floor, an old, battered suitcase. She looked as if she had been lying there for years. But the scariest part was that there were pieces of old, yellowed photos sticking out of it, similar to the ones I found in the basement of the house. I didn't want to go any closer, but something in me made me do it. I carefully approached the suitcase and opened it. Inside were photos, letters, old notes. All of them were wet, damaged by time, but among them I saw something terrible, a photo of the door of the room in which I was now standing. But that wasn't all. On the back of the photo was written, "Don't be afraid, we're close." I felt my heart begin to beat wildly. Who is we? And why are they so close? Then I heard it again. The same steps, which were now not just approaching but were right behind me. I turned sharply and saw what I feared the most. The shadowy figure standing in the doorway of the room was a reality. She seemed to be waiting for me, and I knew that now I had no chance of escape. My head spun and I felt fear paralyze every muscle in me. A shadowy figure was at the threshold of the room, filling the space with itself, and I could not take my eyes off it. It was as if she were alive, with her own will and eerie intent. Her presence wasn't just visual, I felt it in every bone of my body. She was the embodiment of my worst nightmare, and now that nightmare had become a reality. I stepped back as far as I could, but it was pointless. She did not move, but her presence pressed on me from all sides. It seemed that the air itself became heavier, filled with unspeakable horror. I felt that every second here was another step towards inevitable death. A shadowy figure took the first step into the room, and at the same moment the light in the room dimmed, plunging me into darkness. I was left alone with her in this darkness. Her form dissolved into the shadows of the night, but I felt that she was still here, very close. I clenched my fists, trying to find at least some way out of this situation. My gaze darted around the room in search of something that could help me defend myself. The only thing I could find was an old candlestick on the bedside table. I grabbed it, holding it in front of me like a weapon, even though I knew it was unlikely to save me. The shadowy figure began to approach, and every step it took echoed in my head like the blows of a giant hammer. I could feel the panic creeping over me. She was so close that I could feel her cold breath on my skin, even though it was invisible. I made a desperate lunge forward, striking the candlestick in the direction I thought the figure was. But he passed through the air as if nothing was there. The figure melted into the shadows, but the sense of danger only increased. Suddenly, other lights came on in the room. They were old lamps on the ceiling, which flashed a dull yellow light. I saw the figure again, now standing directly in front of me, and the sight was more eerie than I could have imagined. Her face was blurred like a shadow on water, but I could still make out her eyes, empty, black pits staring straight into my soul. These eyes were not just a reflection of darkness, they seemed to pull me in, making me feel all the evil that was hiding behind this figure. And then I heard it again, a whisper that echoes right in my head. It was so loud that it drowned out everything around. It was like thousands of voices screaming at once, each with its own pain, its own fear. I couldn't take it anymore. Consciousness began to lose contact with reality. I felt something pulling me into this dark vortex. My legs buckled and I fell to the floor, feeling the darkness envelop me. But at the last moment, before I completely lost consciousness, I saw a figure leaning towards me, an eerie glint in its eyes. The whispers died down to soft laughter that echoed in my head. And then I realized that this is only the beginning of what will haunt me further, giving me no rest day or night. I passed out, but even in that state I felt that the figure was still near. She didn't disappear, she was waiting for me to wake up to continue my game. And I knew that this nightmare would continue for a very long time. I woke up on the cold floor, my body was stiff, and my head hurt as if someone had hit me with a rock. Consciousness returned slowly, as if through a thick fog. At first I couldn't remember where I was, but when my eyes focused on the dim light of the lamp flickering on the ceiling, reality hit me with all its brutality. I was in the same room where I saw the shadowy figure. An echo of a whisper sounded in his head, which seemed barely noticeable but did not disappear. My hands were shaking as I scrambled to my feet, trying to piece together what was happening. The shadowy figure, was it real? Is all this just a fiction of my consciousness, which gradually collapsed under the onslaught of fear? I turned to the suitcase lying in the middle of the room. It was open and photos and letters were scattered around like pieces of someone's forgotten past. But now there was something else in the room, a feeling that I was no longer alone. It was invisible but extremely real, as if the space around me was filled with something ominous. I went to the window hoping to see at least some sign of the outside world, but what I saw made me flinch. The windows were bricked up. I hadn't noticed it before, but now that I was looking at them, it was obvious that they weren't just blinds or curtains. They were real, rough brick walls that blocked out all the light. Panic gripped me again. I was locked in this room as if trapped. Why didn't I notice this before? How could I stay here? All my attempts to find a way out seemed futile. This motel seemed to have a life of its own, changing and transforming along with my worst fears. My consciousness seemed to be split into pieces, but I had to act. I had to find a way out of here before something worse happened. I went to the door again, hoping I could find another way to freedom. But as soon as I touched the doorknob, I heard it again. This time the sound was clearer. It was footsteps. Someone was approaching the room, and I knew it wasn't just any visitor. Something inside me told me it was a shadowy figure returning. I felt its approach, as one feels a thunderstorm approaching at night. I jumped away from the door, trying to find cover. But there was nowhere to hide in this room. I was trapped. The shadow that had haunted me before was now returning to finish what it had started. The light of the lamp on the ceiling began to flicker again, to dim as if obeying this ominous ritual. The room was filled with a sense of unbearable tension. which became so strong that my heart began to beat wildly. The door slowly began to open and I froze as I watched the darkness grow closer behind it. Something inside me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. My will was subdued by this fear that gripped me more and more. The shadowy figure reappeared in the doorway, its outline more distinct, its presence unbearable. She began to move towards me and every step she took felt like the last one I would ever hear. My thoughts were confused and I didn't know what to do. And then I remembered the photo I found in the suitcase, the one with this door. "Don't be afraid, we are close," it was written. But who is we? Could I find a clue in this to figure out how to avoid this nightmare? I grabbed my suitcase, throwing all the photos back in and started going through them again. Maybe somewhere in these old things was the answer to what was going on? But every moment spent searching for an answer seemed like a waste of time, as the shadowy figure drew closer and closer to me. Her breath was so close now that I could feel it on my skin. But as I continued to search, I came across something else in the suitcase, an old key. He looked like he didn't belong in this place, but he seemed important at the same time. Maybe it was my only hope. The shadowy figure was already very close, and without thinking for a second, I grabbed the key and rushed to the only door in the room. My hands were shaking, but I managed to insert the key into the lock and turn it. The clicking sound was the sweetest melody I had ever heard. The door opened and I ran out into the hallway without looking back. And closed the door behind me, trying to distance myself from what was happening in that room. My heart was beating as if it was going to burst out of my chest. I gasped for air, trying to regain control, but the terror was still seething inside. The corridor was illuminated by a dim light that almost gave no hope of escape. Panic consumed me more and more. The doors of the rooms along the corridor looked the same, as if I had entered an endless maze. Escape became an even greater illusion, but I had to try. I hurried along the corridor, trying to find a way out. The footsteps I heard in the room didn't go away. They became louder, closer. I was not alone in this corridor. A shadowy figure seemed to be chasing me, and every movement I made brought it closer. I could feel the hallway narrowing and the walls closing in, making me suffocate. I noticed a door at the end of the corridor. They differed from the others. They were older, covered with cobwebs, as if they had not been opened for a long time. Maybe this was my chance for salvation. But I understood that time was short. A shadowy figure was already breathing down my back. I ran to the door and, mustering the last of my strength, pressed the handle. The door creaked open into the darkness. But I couldn't stop. Opening them, I stepped inside, hoping it led to an exit. Instead of being outside, I found myself in a narrow, gloomy room. It was sort of like an old basement filled with all kinds of junk. It was difficult for me to breathe because of the smell of rot in the air. I knew there was no way out, but going back was even scarier. Suddenly I heard the door slam shut behind me. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, her face a blur, but that look, it cut to the bone. I realized it was a trap. I had no choice. I returned to the room, scanning it for anything that might help me escape. On the floor among the old things I saw a metal grate. It was a hatch leading down into the darkness, but I had no time to hesitate. I opened it and jumped down without thinking, hoping it would set me free. I fell into the dark tunnel, my body hit the ground painfully. The air was thick, almost unbearable, and I felt fear fill every part of my being. But the shadowy figure remained above, and I realized that this was the only way to salvation. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but I began to crawl forward, feeling every movement bring me pain. Fear and adrenaline pushed me forward, preventing me from stopping. I knew this was my last chance to escape the horror that haunted me. A few minutes seemed like an eternity. I could feel the walls of the tunnel closing in around me, but I kept moving forward. Suddenly I saw a faint light in front of me. It was a way out. Gathering all my strength, I crawled towards the light, hoping it wasn't another trap. When I finally got out of the tunnel, a gloomy forest opened before me. I was free, but the feeling of danger did not disappear. I knew the shadowy figure might be somewhere nearby, but now I had at least some chance to escape. I rushed forward through the forest, not stopping until I felt I could run no more. My consciousness began to fade again and I fell to the ground, breathing heavily. But this time I was outside the walls of the motel, and that gave me hope for salvation. Suddenly I heard sounds, voices and footsteps approaching. I raised my head and saw people. They looked surprised and worried when they approached me. I realized that they were lifeguards. They found me in the woods and I finally felt the fear begin to let go. I survived. This nightmare is over. But even as I was led to safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadowy figure was still somewhere nearby, watching me from the darkness. Maybe this was just the beginning of a new game, and every time I close my eyes, the horror will return again. As I was taken to the hospital, I felt that even though this motel was behind me, its horrible shadows would haunt me for the rest of my life. And who knows, maybe someday someone else, finding themselves in a similar place, will face the same fear that I did.